Disfluencies? What are these?
Disfluencies
Yeah.
are it's something that comes up when you're speaking, even when you're not interpreting, because that was focused on simultaneous interpreting. But when you speak, you produce something that's called disfluencies. So you have two types of disfluencies, which are filled and unfilled pauses. So filled pauses and unfilled pauses can include false starts. So when you start a sentence and then you have to start again because you started it wrong and it didn't say what you wanted it to say. Saying for example, like I just did. Words like that. Well, words. Like 70% of interpreters are female. It's ridiculous. And a lot of the time, it's actually the opposite thing. Some male business owners, CEOs for conferences will ask for a male interpreter not because they want a better interpretation or a different interpretation. They want a male voice. And that's one of the things in interpreting that conveys meaning is the voice. So if you have a male speaker, I mean, I don't think personally that anyone cares if it's a male interpreter, but the person who hires the interpreter sometimes will choose a not so good but male interpreter just because they're male. So generally when that happens, it's not for quality purposes, it's for voice purposes. I don't think that interferes so much with the interpretation itself, but it's quite a subjective question. I wouldn't suggest to pick your interpreter based on their gender or their voice. Pick him on the quality of their interpreting.
Yeah, well, that was one of my fears because this tends to get quite political. I mean, this is not a place where I will try or to even approach what is right or what is not right. The quality, of course, is definitely what we should focus on. I think the question basically was still, would it be right to give thought to the possibility of there being a difference between that at all? And I don't know. What do you think? That was actually a preview of our upcoming interview with my good friend Tilly, so be sure to stick around. An dieser Stelle aber möchte ich zunächst meinen Dank besonders an alle meine Zuhörer auf Spotify aussprechen. Ich stelle fest, dass meine Zuhörer hier am aktivsten sind. Da ich meine ersten 3000 Downloads nähere, ist dies heute ein Beispiel dafür, wie ich mit eurem Feedback arbeite, indem ich es mir zur Pflicht mache, diese Episode mit einem Dank an euch persönlich zu beginnen. Ich werde mir vielleicht nie 100% sicher sein, warum eigentlich einige von euch abonnieren. Wegen des pädagogischen Werts, wegen des Unterhaltungswerts oder einfach aus Neugier. Alles ist gut. Hier erlaube ich mir einen entspannteren, zugänglicheren Ansatz zu verfolgen. Genau weil es darum geht, dass wir alle miteinander reden. Ich möchte, dass du den gleichen Ansatz verfolgst, indem du mir persönlich sagst, was du persönlich denkst, unter feedback.englishcoachpodcast.com.
Herzlich willkommen zum English Coach Podcast, präsentiert von trainingtree.de, die personalisierte Lösung im Bereich Erwachsenenbildung. Und jetzt dein Gastgeber. Er sagt zwar immer ich und dich, ansonsten ist sein Deutsch fantastisch. iAntonio Patterson.
Okay, so that was my attempt at German, my second, or well, should I say my third language. I have always wanted to do that, and I think there is no better time than now. Now, I'm still doing this for learners of English, especially, well, what I like to call my people. You know yourselves, present and past course participants. Yes, I want you to feel spoken to. This is very important because while you can listen on Spotify, iTunes, Deezer, Google, etc., and I'm very thankful for what these platforms offer, they're doing their own thing at being pretty much everything for everybody. This is not what I'm doing here. I'm talking to you, the person, right now. I want to know what you think, not what these platforms tell me on your behalf. So as soon as you find some time, just use the feedback form and quickly tell me personally what you think. All right, so in today's episode 14, we look at some questions surrounding machine assisted translation and interpretation. And we look at what are called disfluencies in the spoken language. These are relevant, I think, for any learner of English as a second language because, we all use these little tools from time to time. Or it's important for any learner of any language for that matter. We also touch on some issues relating to gender differences in performing the job of interpretation. Very interesting, I think. Some of the things discussed here today dovetail with two previous episodes. In the previous episode 13, The Lived Experience, we looked at the influence and choice of voice for the message you want to convey, with the lovely and talented author, singer, and songwriter and vocal coach, Ms. Natalie Claude. Be sure to check it out. In the previous episode 9, English for Work and Play, we discussed the possible impact of, those sometimes less than elegant interjections we use in the spoken language, with none other than the indomitable Sibylle von Spitzen. Be sure to check it out again if you haven't had a chance to listen yet. Today's guest is a language professional, simply put. I had the opportunity to meet her through my well-known preoccupation with the performing arts. She is, by all means, someone who has managed, so to speak, to tickle my intellectual fancy in more ways than one, such that I feel compelled to share today yet another instance of where life meets language. So without further ado, our guest for today, Ms. Clotilde Duchy. Here we are again for the second part of our interview with the lovely and talented Clotilde. No, I'm very happy to have you here. And today we will actually be touching a little bit on the science behind interpretation and translation and the basis of this, which I think is interesting also to some learners of English, or could be, should be at least, are your postgraduate work, your last work, and also your undergraduate work. Now, the undergraduate thesis that you wrote asked the question, will machine translation replace interpreters? That is the question that was asked. And please correct me if I'm wrong. The postgraduate work looked at gender differences in simultaneous interpreting. It was a comparative study on disfluencies.
Yes, that's it.
Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Fantastic.
Indeed.
Now, good. I want to ask you to tell me exactly what that means. You can start with probably your undergraduate. Let's see, will machine translation replace interpreters?
Yes, I was looking as to whether machines would replace interpreters because I was going on to an interpreting degree. So I was wondering, is my future doomed? Because everyone was always telling me that machines will replace interpreters because, Google Translate is so good now. Wow. Obviously, I disagree with that. That was sarcastic. But yeah, so I was kind of looking into the progress that machine translation has made over the past few decades, because it's actually quite an old thing. It's one of the first things that computers learn how to do, to translate.
Really?
Yeah, it was very early on that people started creating machine translation systems. It's quite interesting.
Yeah.
And I was looking at different types of machine translation. So there's machine translation, computer-assisted translations, which are for translators who they use help from computers to translate faster. Still the translator doing most of the work. And then I was looking into interpreting, so how those machine translations may replace interpreters. So, for example, as you mentioned earlier, one of your friends the other day pulled out their phone, said something to their phone, and then the phone translated it into another language, right? Sent it back. And that's something that people always tell me is going to replace interpreters. So I was looking into how effective that can be in the future, how much that is going to develop. And really, It's developed a lot over the past few years, especially the past, I think 4 or 5 years now with Google Neural Machine Translation, which is just a switch in Google to a new system which looks at meaning, like chunks of meaning and context over just phrases. And so phrase-based translation, which is the old system that they used. And that's actually improved Google's translation a lot. However, there are a lot of things that I think Google or just generally translation systems need to improve upon to replace interpreters or even replace translators. So yeah, there's the fact that there's voice recognition and then voice production. You can't translate accents, sarcasm. Machines aren't able so far to produce that. So yeah, that's what I was looking into. So yeah, there's a few questions that arise from there.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, I am very interested in this, of course, as not just because of, well, let's say, the reason I'm doing this is not just because of my own interest. It's because I thinking about this, conversing with this idea is something that could probably help to give learners of a foreign language a bit of perspective, and it should help them to decide whether they should basically give up and wait on Google, or they should invest the time and learn the language. Now, Mark, I have never been one to say that, listen, you should only find one way to do something, and that's the only way. I always encourage people to try as many sources as they can. So I do encourage people to use apps and computer programs, but you have to know what these can do, what their limits are, and so on and so forth, right? Now, thank you for that, Tilly. However, I just want to add here, in terms of the idea of context. In preparation for our little talk today, I have just two things that I want to mention. I spoke to a developer about the idea of artificial intelligence, machine learning. Now that's another story, because the insight from the developer was that context is probably the most difficult thing to integrate into algorithms, for example, because contexts are variables that are external variables that are variables, and they can't be so easily defined. That's the first thing. The second thing is I also spoke to a computer scientist who said, well, but this is more philosophical. She says artificial intelligence doesn't really exist. Yes, the intelligence that we call artificial is actually the intelligence of people. But that's another topic.
Yeah. So about the first question about algorithms. From what I've researched, well, for interpreting especially, is algorithms are probably the easiest part. That would be to solve for interpreting, for machine interpreting, because to input context, you need to just put tags on words. Well, it's not that easy, because it's tedious, and it's forever changing, especially because language completely evolves all the time, every day. But yeah, you need to put tags on words so that depending on those tags, if they fit a certain translation of that word that's looking to translate next, if the tags actually fit it, then they can suppose that that original word with those tags that fit is the right one. So that's doable in theory. The problem being that, people's understanding and like the tags kind of vary depending on people. So some people may have a different understanding of words and may have different associations with it. So, it's also very individual. And what was your second point again?
The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, or just to mention that people have to be aware of, is the fact that you have to enter good language into these translation programs at first in order to get good language out.
Yeah, even if the translation is absolutely perfect, if you're making a mistake in the input, the translation will suffer from it, because it will interpret the word that you put in as a name, for example, if the spelling is so wrong that it can't recognize a word. Your spell check can't always recognize your words. So even if you're using spell check, you might make mistakes. And also grammatically, it may alter the meaning So, yeah, even if the translation system is perfect, if you make grammatical errors in your original language and you don't speak the target language very well, at least, you can't see if it's made a mistake or not. So always proofread your Google Translate. Trust me.
Yeah.
Trust me, because
Well-
I've made that mistake of using Google Translate for homework. Considering I've learned many languages, I've had mistakes in many languages with Google Translate, and my grades have suffered from it.
Yeah.
So I decided to stop using it and just use my brain and Lingui.
Yeah, and I mean these translation things, since we're on the topic of it, I mean, I will not get specific, but there are companies that I know of, I have personal knowledge of, they actually forbid the use of translators in their companies because
You mean machine
in
translations? or-
machine
yeah.
translations, as for example Google Translator, for example, is forbidden within these companies
Privacy
because
issues?
of course
Yeah, of
privacy issues. They have to take this language to build the knowledge base. Yes.
Yeah.
The machine learning that
Yeah,
takes place
that's
has to happen by taking your data. And I mean, it's not just random abstract stuff, it's going into the meaning. Now, do you
Yeah.
want to send your meaning to Google?
exactly. For example, I believe it's the European Commission or European Council, but one of the. They're using a machine translation to translate most of their documents just to save time, and then it needs to be proofread, obviously. And honestly, proofreading is a lot of work.
Oh,
So
yes.
they can't rule out translators yet, but they use that machine translation. The only thing is, it's not Google Translate. It's not owned by any company apart from themselves. So obviously, that meaning and that content is not coming out and being leaked out. For example, like a lot of translators use machine-assisted translation, but it's a closed system. For example, Trados. But if you're using Google Translate to do professional translations, you will probably get fired and sued if it's, for example, a business a company or a medical translation that you're doing because of the privacy of it. Because Google obviously also has a cloud for translators who use it. So that they can share their translations, and obviously that content you can't always let loose. Let's say.
Yeah, sensitive information.
Yeah,
You
so
can't put that in.
you got to be careful if you're a translator. You got to be very careful what system you're using. Trados, for example, is an official translation system. It is for translators, and you can share content with other translators. But sometimes they have their own pool of words within the company, etc. It's like quite private.
Have you heard of DeepL?
Yeah, I've used it at uni.
Yeah. I like
good for it.
DeepL. I like
Yeah.
DeepL. I mean, they were pretty candid up front. They said, well, listen, if you're using the cheap version, not the cheap version, if you're using the free version, we will be using your language to help to develop our database.
Trados is pay you have to pay for
Yeah.
anyway. So
And you can
basically.
pay where they say, well, if you pay, then your inputs are deleted from our servers. But
Yeah.
even then, I mean,
Well,
when is it deleted? Yeah.
Most translation agencies or companies who use in-house translators will already have paid for Trados, and they'll have paid to let you use it and let you create an account on it. So if you're working for a translation agency or as a translator, either you're freelance, you pay for your own Trados and it's your own account and that's it, or you're in an agency and you're in a house and then they pay for it and you can use it. So
Okay.
yeah, it really depends what exactly you do. But yeah, DeepL is okay. I just don't like to use machine translation. I like to use, for example, Lingui to look up a word and then determine the context for myself.
I use both. I mean, the thing is,
You can use both together, yeah.
Of course. I use Lingui, of course, to see context, how other people used it. I usually, sometimes I write in English, then I put it into DeepL or Google Translate, and I assume then that what I get from them, if I use short sentences and simple expressions, then it's like 85%
Yeah,
ready.
I do that in Russian.
Then I shape it after
Yeah,
that.
exactly. You can't just use it and not proofread it, not check what it gives you, because there will always be even a small mistake.
Yeah.
So gotta be careful.
All right. Well, I'm still very much interested. I'm very impressed with this. No, the question is actually close to the same question. The question I have for you is just one question for today, which I think will be, the answer to which, or let's say approaching the answer, because we never really know what will happen. Approaching the answer to this will, I think, be valuable to anyone learning a language. And the question is, will these things replace the need to learn a foreign language?
So I was, just to clarify, I was looking into will these things replace interpreters,
Oh, okay.
which is a very specific profession.
Yeah.
But I can answer your question. Well, at least give my opinion. I think if you want to communicate in the language efficiently, if you want to actually talk to people from a different culture, in the end, you will always need to learn the language, or they will need to learn your language, because there is a wild difference between going to a country. Let's say you're going to Japan, you want to order, I don't know, tuna sashimi or something. You can tell your phone, I want 6 tuna sashimi, and then it can say it in Japanese, and the person will understand 6 tuna sashimi. But they might not understand that you said I want and not I would like, for example. You know, there's details like that, subtleties. And that means in terms of communicating with people and really really conveying your, you know, your culture, your meaning, your friendliness or your non-friendliness. That's something that machine translation so far cannot really convey. It's definitely going to improve. I'm not worried about that. But really, do you really want to talk to your phone and then it translate it to the person and then talk to your phone and then they that translates it to you? Like, how much time do you have to spend on just talking to your phone? Just, if you want to really communicate with people, honestly, just learn languages, even learning the basics, and then, you know, it'll improve naturally. You can kind of use both, and even by using, you know, machine translation and stuff like that, you end up learning stuff at the same time. So I think in terms of need, if it's just for traveling and going to visit places, you don't really need to learn the language. You can communicate, like, you know, people have communicated via you know, hand movements and stuff like that before. So now, you know, we've got a little bit of help on that side. But I think it's necessary to learn other languages if you really want to work with people who come from countries where those other languages are spoken. I mean, have you ever tried to find a job without speaking English? It's hard, isn't it? I mean, I can imagine a lot of you listening, like, our audience, have applied for jobs was like, oh, how well is your how good is your English? How well is your English? Look at me.
How well do you speak?
How well do you speak English? How good is your English? And then you go like, oh, I'm learning it. I'm working on it. And, you know, they'll be like, nah. Like, my job that I'm going to start soon is in French and German, but still, like, 90% of the paperwork they send me is in English. So, you know, if I don't understand English very well, I am in not in the best place, let's say.
Oh yes. That's a nice way to say it. All right, fine. In terms of then the question of replacement, well, you know, I mean, to be specific and to be true as well, your undergraduate thesis did say, well, will it replace interpreters, not the need to learn a new language,
and not translators. It was very specific to interpreters.
Exactly.
So obviously I was looking at machine translation because that's the basic for machine interpreting. So voice to voice translation, which is you input a voice and it gives you a voice back. I don't think it's ever, at least not in my lifetime, going to replace interpreters. I could go deep into why artificial intelligence cannot fix that problem, but that's, you know, I will link my thesis somewhere accessible through this podcast.
I will link your thesis.
Yes, but I will send I will send a link so that you can add it in. But I'll if you're interested in that, you can read it. Good luck. It's quite long.
Of course.
But yeah, I don't think in my lifetime it's going to replace interpreters. And translators slowly being replaced, but for very specific documents that are repetitive and boring, and you still need proofreading a lot of it. So there's still jobs out there. Interpreting is a very specific kind of work. So if you look into it, you can understand where I'm coming from.
Well, you know, Tilly, you have somehow answered my question. My question is, because, you know, the reason why my question is structured that way is because many people, they buy these little gadgets, and as I said, you can use them, you can mix them. I have nothing against them, but can we really expect that these gadgets are going to replace the need to learn a foreign language? That is the question. And from what we said, not now, unless, I don't know, maybe when we start getting implants or something. I don't know. Yeah,
there's like those little earbuds that have been released like a few years ago. That's something I mentioned in that dissertation. They were released, but then they were pulled out, I think. There's like a lot of those machines that were released and they were so bad that they were just pulled off the market.
Yeah.
So for the moment, Google Translate is the most reliable source because it's got the most data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, for example, you know how people told us, you know, you won't have a calculator in your pocket all your life. We do have that, but does it mean that you shouldn't know that 2 + 2 = 4? Like, you know,
Yeah.
you need the minimum of some things to be able to use one of those machines. I don't think it's wise to use technology without knowing the basic behind it, like the basic system, because otherwise you're just blindly using something and then you can make a fool out of yourself without even knowing it. So definitely, I think it's worth learning languages.
We answered the question. You know, I mean, in the previous interview we had, you also said we spoke quite a lot about the cultural aspects and that example you used, difference between I want and I would like in Japan. Yes, I can imagine, because their sensitivities, politeness and so on. These sensitivities are even stronger. And even in English, there's a big difference. In German as well. Ich will. Im Vergleich zu ich möchte.
Ich hätte gern.
Ja, ich hätte gern. Yeah. We can definitely sense a difference there. And these are the nuances that you will only get from interaction with real people.
Exactly.
All right. Now, the second thing, so let's see here, your postgraduate work. Again, it looked at gender differences in simultaneous interpreting, a comparative study on disfluencies. Now, this was a postgraduate thesis, yes? So I mean, within this forum, you know, it would be way too short for us to go too deep into this. But I'm very interested in the meaning, though, of this word here, disfluencies.
Disfluencies
what are these?
Are I just made one. It's something that comes up when you're speaking. Even when you're not interpreting, because that was focused on simultaneous interpreting. But when you speak, you produce something that's called disfluencies. So you have 2 types of disfluencies, which are filled and unfilled pauses. So filled pauses and unfilled pauses can include false starts. So when you start a sentence and then you have to start again because you started it wrong and it didn't say what you wanted it to say. Saying for example, like I just did. Words like that, sounds like that you produce when you're thinking. Making a pause with no sound, that's not meant to be in the middle of that sentence. It's not in the right place it's not meant to have meaning and punctuate your sentence. You know, when you speak, you will make pauses between certain chunks of your sentence to convey meaning. And when it's not on purpose, that's called an unfilled pause. Sounds like hesitation or lengthening a word. So, for example, just that. So, that lengthening is a sign of hesitation and it's a disfluency.
Okay.
And it's something that people produce, and it's particularly striking in interpreting, because in interpreting, in simultaneous interpreting, you have to be very sparing with your time. You have no time to waste because someone's speaking and they don't care if you don't follow what they're saying. If you're hesitating, you're wasting so much time that you could be spending interpreting other thing that person is saying. So you're wasting a lot of time, and you are sometimes wasting even content because you don't have time to say some things that you've heard anymore because you've wasted some time before that.
Yes.
So in interpreting, it's very important to minimize those disfluencies, and that's why I looked into that. I considered it in this dissertation an indicator of quality, because the fewer disfluencies you produce, the nicer it is to listen, the more time you have to interpret, and the easier it gets for you. So it does have some kind of link with the quality of your interpreting as a user, as someone who's going to listen to you.
Yeah. You know, thank you for that, Tilly. I find it quite interesting because I recently did a podcast episode where I looked at interjections. Interjections are, for example, exclamation utterances or words that we use sometimes. A common one these days is super or
Supergeil.
amazing, or in German we say geil, yes,
Yeah.
or something
Genau.
like that.
Das ist not
Yeah,
examination, but
and
it's
these are interjections which actually do communicate some kind of meaning. Now, whether they're overused or not, which was the topic of the last interview, that's another story. But would an interjection, an exclamation, for example, super, would that also be considered, or can that be also considered a disfluency?
Well, that's unlikely to happen in interpreting because you wouldn't say that unless the person said it, because it's actually something that has meaning and it's on purpose.
Okay.
So disfluencies are done not on purpose, just like, how unfilled pauses
Ah.
can be on purpose to punctuate a sentence, just like you could say super to punctuate a sentence,
Mm-hmm.
or like swear words, are used in English quite often to punctuate sentences.
Yes.
So this is unlikely to be unwilling, like accidental.
Oh,
You would
okay.
rarely say super or extra or amazing without really meaning something behind it. It might be overused,
Yes.
and it might be something that shows a lack of vocabulary or a lack of imagination. I don't know, but but it has some meaning behind it. It's on purpose.
Okay, so it's not
So
a
it's not
disfluency
disfluency.
then. Understood. It's funny because I looked at the interjections, which are usually, as I said, utterances or words which are communicating some kind of surprise or
Yeah,
exclamation.
means something.
I also, of course, it's not a disfluency. However, I also looked at the tendency then to utter profanity, like that, famous four-letter word that's, that we like to use. Yeah.
Love that word.
Well,
My favorite word. It means so many things.
I have a book on it right there. It's on the shelf right there. You can see it. It's a whole book on that four-letter word. Very interesting.
That makes me think. There's a film that I really like called The Family, and in there's a little scene where there's a kid who's talking about how his father always uses that word, and it can mean anything.
Yes.
It can mean that they really appreciate something. It can mean that you hate something, that someone's really annoyed you. You might be pissed off. You might be really happy. It can mean literally anything. Literally is also one of those words that's overused. But in this case, very literally can mean literally anything.
That's true. And I kid you
such
not.
a good word.
This is the book in front of me. It's written by one Sterling Johnson. And it's called English as a Second Beep Language.
Yeah.
Right? And it goes into this many splendid four-letter word that I'm not allowed to use, within this context. But, in this case, as I was just saying that I used it, I compared it also with interjections, profanities, and that in this case would not be disfluency.
No.
Thank you for that distinction.
No worries.
Tilly. All right. Now let's see here. Your topic, interpreting. Now, we're not gonna go so deeply into this today because, well, obviously it is quite a huge topic. However, it interested me because it was your second thesis, and of course, I will be also putting a link to this if you want me to link it. I will definitely link it. So anyone who's interested in reading through it and learning something, nothing is wrong with getting a little structure because, sometimes it's like, again, a comparison between formal and informal. When you have structure, identifying the differences between, subtle differences between disfluencies, fill words, interjections, profanities, all of these, they're very close, but they're a little bit different. Yes? So when you have a little structure that you will get from reading something like this, you could also benefit because you have more context, you have more association, more understanding. It would be good for your language. So link to this thesis later. However, what was the outcome? You asked a question here.
So the postgraduate research, so that was actually collecting data. So it was not just researching for myself, well, actually reading other people's work. So the outcome of my own data analysis, so it was quite a small sample size, but still it was kind of quite inconclusive, but it did point at a potential difference between the genders. So because it's such a small sample size, you can't conclude anything for sure. You cannot be sure that any of the results are conclusive. Just they say what they say. You got to take it with a pinch of salt. And in this instance, it pointed at some disfluencies are uttered by women more often than by men. So some of the, for example, filled disfluencies are something that men do more, and women will produce more unfilled disfluencies. It's also the length of those disfluencies. So I had to measure how long some people don't talk for when they should be talking. So there was those differences. So in that regard, it was inclusive because not all the results pointed at the same thing, but it was really interesting to see that there are quite striking differences, and then you have to find out the reason why are they those differences, and that's what I was looking at in the conclusion, why there would be differences between the genders and their utterance of disfluencies. And mostly I focused on the social aspect of how men and women, well, girls and boys are raised to, use languages more, etc. Therefore be potentially better interpreters or not so good interpreters. So, so to keep it short, it's if there is a difference, which I can't say for sure, and no one has been able to so far, if there is a difference, it's probably due to a social tailoring of the people.
It's socialized differences.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you know what? Maybe it's better that it's conclusive, yes, because I try to avoid certain
that could
depths.
Be quite problematic.
But
it was very interesting to look into.
Same here. It's there's so many things that come to mind now. For example, I would ask you a question. For example, if there is some kind of perceived difference, depending on, of course, your perspective, where you're coming from, and taking into consideration, of course, the socialization aspect. From your experience, then, would you suggest that, let's say, you have a female politician talking about a certain topic, would you suggest or would you recommend that a female interpreter also does the interpretation for her, so they have a better feel of the background?
So that's something I looked into as well, because there's a lot of sexism. Well, not so much in interpreting, but it's a place that's still quite sexist, even though there's mostly female interpreters. Like 70% of interpreters are female. It's ridiculous. And a lot of the time, it's actually the opposite thing. Some male business owners, CEOs for conferences will ask for a male interpreter not because they want a better interpretation or a different interpretation. They want a male voice. And that's one of the things in interpreting that conveys meaning is the voice. So if you have a male speaker, I don't think personally that anyone cares if it's a male interpreter, but the person who hires the interpreter sometimes will choose a not so good but male interpreter just because they're male. So generally when that happens, it's not for quality purposes, it's for voice purposes. I don't think that interferes so much with the interpretation itself, but it's quite a subjective question. I wouldn't suggest to pick your interpreter based on their gender or their voice. Pick him on the quality of their interpreting.
Yeah, well, that was one of my fears, because this tends to get quite political. This is not a place where I will try or to even approach what is right or what is not right. The quality, of course, is definitely what we should focus on. I think the question basically was still, would it be right to give thought to the possibility of there being a difference between that at all? And I don't know. What do you think?
I was looking into that question of gender because there's such a big disparity between the genders in the interpreting community. So as I said, there's I believe 73% of interpreters worldwide are female, which is a huge difference if you look at any other kind of let's say group of professions. Generally, like interpreting translation has such a huge difference, and it's mainly female dominated, which is pretty impressive. So I was looking into that because of this, but I think I was questioning why there was that difference. And I think the question of whether you should hire a male or female interpreter, if you're going to ask that, it's got to be based on whether the voice and the fact that there may be a difference in the what gender the voice sounds, if you can even say that, how it sounds to the listener compared to what they're looking at. So if they're looking at a female politician and they're hearing a male voice, even if you
Will that have an effect?
Yeah, would that have an effect on the person's understanding? Probably not. Would that have an effect on their experience? Maybe a little. That's a question that I've not investigated. But if you're going to look at whether you should hire someone of the same gender as the person who's speaking, it's got to be based on the user experience, because otherwise it's just sexist and stupid. It makes no sense. It doesn't have any purpose. So if you're going to ask that question, it's got to be looking at the user experience. And I personally don't think it should affect the user experience, but I've not done research on that. I don't think it should. I don't think it should, but it doesn't mean it doesn't. So it's worth looking into. If there's an undergraduate or postgraduate student here, you're welcome to study this.
Yes. I mean, the thing is, I'm a listener. I am aware of, for example, what sexism is. And I am aware of, maybe whatever tendencies I might have from time to time, whether by accident or through culturing or whatever. But there are some people who are just not thinking about that at all, and I mean, as I said,
it might not be on purpose.
I'm not gonna touch on the politics today. Of course, quality is definitely what should be the deciding criteria, and I think that is where we should leave it. Yeah, for now. All right.
Absolutely.
So that was quite interesting. I suspect that this topic might come up again at another time. I know for a fact that we will continue this conversation on the separate cover, of course, Tilly. So be warned.
I will be back. Not gotten rid of me just yet.
Be warned. Yeah. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank you all for listening. I hope it was interesting for you. I hope you found some value. And Tilly, thank you very much for sharing today. It was a pleasure, and it always is.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here and having me ramble on about my life. But I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope that some of the advice I gave may be helpful. And till next time, I guess.
So all in way of saying, what exactly? All right, I always ask myself this question once we've gotten to the reflection section of the episodes. And here I ask myself the question, what did I derive from all of this? Well, the most important things I got were, well, first of all, there will always be apps and services and all these other things that help us, little tools that we use to get our message across in another language. I would not suggest, I've never been one to say that you should not use these tools. All these apps, there are also learning apps out there, different ones. I'm not going to advertise for anyone on my show right now. But I've never been one to say to anyone that they should not use any one thing. As long as it works for you, you should use it. But I would recommend that you keep the mix fresh and lively. You have to mix the things up. Do not get tied down with one thing, because one thing, one tool will not help you. If you use Google Translate sometimes you can switch over to DeepL. Maybe sometimes you can use a person. And when you use these machines, it is better, I think, to also have it looked over by some kind of professional in the field, a living, breathing person. And this person will help it to get to that 100% acceptability. Now, we could talk about, the fact that whether something is ever perfect. This is not about perfection, right? Correction can go on forever from the experiences that I've had. And there's no joke there, that is really the case. It never ends. However, I do suggest that if you use a translation program, it's good to have it looked over by a human being who has a better grasp of context, which is very hard to automate. All right, the second thing that I've learned is, the influence of gender. Yes, we discussed that a little bit. We never really gave an answer. That's not what we're about here. I do not try to give any kind of answer. I might ask more questions and, throw some more ideas into the mix. But that is not my job to try to pretend as if I can, give answers for these things. That's not what I'm about at all, right? So I just hope that you were given some ideas. Nothing is wrong with conversing with ideas, getting a chance to think about some of the things that influence the message and the way the message is received by your listener, based on the gender sometimes, based on the job you're doing, and so on. I found it very interesting. Again, it's not a question that we're attempting to answer, but I hope you can take from it what you found valuable. Another thing that was quite important that we got from this interview, I got a little more attentive to what we call disfluencies. Now, as I said before, we touched on what can also be called disfluencies in episode 9, I think it was, together with Sibylle von Spitzen, where we talked about how we use words like super tired, super strong, super long, super good, things like that, or different kinds of interjections we use sometimes when we just don't have a word. Yes, we don't know what to say, so we just stick a word in. It could be a word, it could be a non-word, or it could be, it could even be profanity. So from that context, you could also look at some of these interjections as disfluencies, I think. All right, so these were the things that I derived from our interview today. It was very interesting to me, and I hope now that we're a little more aware of them, then we can pay attention to them a little bit more, not only in the target language or the language we're learning, but also in our native languages. Maybe you just notice now that you always use or you stretch words a little bit too long when you're thinking about something. Stretching that word suggests to your listener that you are thinking and you don't really know what it is you want to say yet. Now, that can have the effect of coming across authentically. I don't know, maybe that is the intention of using these, or repetition. Sometimes repetition is actively or purposely included into speeches so people get a stronger understanding of what is being said. Sometimes these are purposely used for effect. Now, you can decide whether you want to use them or not. It's just good to know what they are and how they are probably being seen by others, so you know the effect they're having on your listener. All right, so that was the value I got from it. Very good, very interesting indeed. We shall definitely continue with this conversation another time. Yeah, chances are there is gonna be a part 2 to this interview, and I would invite you to check it out. Stay tuned. If you're not subscribed yet, you can subscribe if you want, and then you'll know when the part 2 to this interview is published. All right, I hope you got some value from it, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you. With a small win is always a good way to begin. Feel free to check out the show notes for this episode at www.trainingtree.de/podcast. Like it if you like it, and if you don't, lie to me. But still, feel free to share it with a friend, post a rating, or better yet, write a comment. This will help it to help you as it is intended to do. Subscribe only if you feel like, so you know when there's a new episode available. Thanks for listening. Looking forward to hearing from you, and bye for now.